Hello, Tolkien geeks! If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing for more Rings of Power analysis and Tolkien and Lord of the Rings lore content. And don't forget to press the like button and even leave a comment below to help this channel reach more new viewers in the future. These videos are made possible by my Patreon community. To check out the benefits of becoming a patron, click the link in the description. Tolkien, as we all know, was an author who placed great emphasis on the power of world-building in his fiction. The Hobbits, as we came to know them in The Lord of the Rings, were known by a number of names. Periannath in Sindarin, Cúd Dúcan in Rohirric, rendered as Holbeatla by Tolkien on the page in Old English, and Banakil in Westeron, rendered in modern English as halfling. Harfoot is not another name for halflings, or even proto-hobbits exactly. The Harfoots that we've seen in Amazon's television series are a reference to a passage in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings called Concerning Hobbits, in which Tolkien is applying his world-building acumen to the hobbits of the Shire to explain their previously unexplained roots in his world. He describes how the little folk once dwelt further east and migrated westward largely to avoid the conflicts of the big folk in the Third Age, though he makes it clear that hobbits had probably existed in some form or other since the Elder Days. Details of the history of the hobbits from before the Third Age are pretty much non-existent, however. In Chapter 2 to the first book of The Lord of the Rings, which was The Shadow of the Past, Gandalf claims at one point, in response to Frodo's line of inquiry regarding Smeagol, to know more about the origins of hobbits than hobbits do themselves. If Gandalf indeed knew more than the prologue elucidates about hobbits during the First and Second Ages, however, then he never reveals anything of great note. Tolkien certainly preferred for this matter to be a mysterious one, and you can see why. What we do know is that the Harfoots were one of three ancient tribes of the Hobbit folk. The other two were the Fallowhides and the Stors. In Concerning Hobbits, Tolkien says that the Harfoots were smaller in stature than their cousins from amongst the Fallowhides and the Stors, browner of skin on average, and were a skilled people with nimble, dexterous fingers. The Harfoots were accustomed to wearing no shoes on their feet. They were the most numerous of the Hobbit clans, and thus the most indicative of mainstream Hobbit culture and typical Hobbit behaviour. In contrast, the Fallowhides tended to be taller for hobbits, and the Stors were broader and heavier than their cousins from amongst the other tribes. Of the hobbits that we know from The Lord of the Rings, most of them are from the upper classes of Hobbit society. Frodo, Merry and Pippin are all cousins, and they share a common ancestry from amongst the Took family, which was really the closest thing that the Shire had to a nobility. The Tooks and the Brandybucks, and by extension Bilbo and Frodo as well, are therefore amongst the descendants of Fallowhide stock on their Took side. The roots of Samwise and the decidedly working-class Gamgee family are not stated explicitly anywhere in the text, and presumably would have been unknown to the Gamgees themselves, but Sam is noted to have brown-skinned hands on a couple of occasions in The Return of the King, which might be an indication that he was descended from the Harfoots. It's impossible to track the complete migratory movements of the Hobbits, though we do know a bit about their earlier history in the Third Age, and we can make some educated guesses as well. As the Hobbits were said to have been an offshoot of the race of men, it's reasonable to assume that they also had their beginnings in the furthest east of Middle-earth, and moved westward over the millennia. Indeed, Concerning Hobbits speculates exactly this. The Silmarillion, which contains precious little details about hobbits, tells us that men first awoke in the distant land of Hildorien, which was on the far side of the mythical supercontinent. Perhaps hobbits also had their origins there, or somewhere nearby. Concerning hobbits claims that it was the Harfoots who first passed west over the mountains into Eriador, while the Stores still lingered for a time by the vales of the River Anduin, including presumably near to the Gladden Fields, where Deagol and Smeagol, who according to Gandalf were from a remnant who were descended from the Stores, find the One Ring later in the Third Age. And finally, we're told that the Fallowhides dwelt further north and passed last of all over the mountains, over a pass to the north of Rivendell, before following the Horwell River southwest. Concerning hobbits speculates, according to the legends of the hobbit folk themselves, that the hobbits left Rhovanion and crossed the Misty Mountains in order to escape the multiplying of men in the area, and the shadow that had fallen on Greenwood the Great, which became known as Mirkwood at that time. We know that this occurred around the turn of the first millennium of the Third Age. Sauron didn't start using Dol Guldur as an alternate base of operations until after he first returned in physical form, following his defeat in the War of the Last Alliance. We also know that the hobbits entered and settled in the Bree lands around the year 1300 of the Third Age, fleeing the rise of the evil kingdom of Angmar. By that time, all three of the groups had crossed the Misty Mountains into Eriador, and many individual tribes and settlements had taken the bolder and more adventurously inclined Fallowhides as their leaders and chieftains, indicating a reunification of these three tribal groups once passing over the mountains. The hobbits, led by the chieftains Marco and Blanco, finally colonized the Shire by leave of the King of Arnor in the year 1601 of the Third Age. The Rings of Power show, set well before all of these recorded events, in the Second Age, has placed the Harfoot tribe to the southeast of the region of Rhovanion, and just to the north of the land that will go on to become Mordor. The showrunners have opted against giving us any dates for any of the events, but the fact that they've heavily compressed the timeline of events is widely known, making it difficult to make comparisons or predictions. But in fact, the Harfoots in the TV show appear to be located in the region which later comes to be known as the Brown Lands, which was labelled on the Middle-earth map in The Lord of the Rings, and which Tolkien at one point considered to be the location of the Gardens of the Entwives in the Second Age. So we might also expect the mysterious Entwives to show up in the Harfoot storyline at some point in the TV show. Although we can't precisely backtrace the path that the Hobbits took generally, or that the Harfoots took specifically, this seems like a reasonable area to place them in geographically during this period, based on the rate of migration that we see from them according to what we know of them in the Third Age. The notion that the Harfoots should be a nomadic tribal group at this point in history is an interesting idea, though, one which makes them feel very far removed from the Hobbits of the Shire that we're most familiar with, which might seem like a strange choice, especially when the familiarity of the casual audience seems to have been one of the producers' primary reasons for including hobbits in their storyline at all. In the TV show, it seems clear that the migrations of the tribe are seasonal, as they're operating on an annual schedule, and the dialogue indicates that they're constantly relocating to areas that they're already familiar with. Mention is made of the Grove, which is the apparent destination of their migration in Season 1, and there's no conscious effort to permanently relocate west at this point. Their migrations, after a certain point in their development, would have been more periodical and sudden, caused by the upheavals seen in the wars against Sauron, rather than the kind of habitual wandering that we've seen from these Harfoots on television. Given their current proximity to Mordor, one imagines that the narrative will give them a reason to journey westward, and perhaps settle in the foothills between the eastern entrance to Khazad-dûm and the Great River, as the text would seem to suggest. This, of course, would place them close to Lothlorien as well, which could have narrative implications. Perhaps we'll see them establish a sort of permanent settlement here or somewhere else, which could conclude the storyline quite nicely. It's much, much too early for them to be settling the Shire, as I've just demonstrated, but who knows what these writers have in mind with this invented storyline. I'd like to see the Harfoots settle in a permanent hidden place somewhere east of the mountains, because the text might support that idea.
And my axe.
Thank you to my Axe Tier Patreon supporters. And also, a small apology. I forgot to include the Patreon roll call in last week's video on Sauron, for which I must beg your forgiveness and understanding. So a huge thank you to my Axe Tier members, Erin M, Joshua Boniface, Arvedwi of Arnor, Anissa Strickland, aka Nessie, and our newest axe wielders, Sean Edmiston, who just rejoined and upped his pledge recently, and V. Hume, a brand new patron since last month. Huge love and gratitude to all of you, and to all who pledge at every tier level. You guys make all of this possible. Please subscribe to Voice of Geekdom for commentary and analysis on Tolkien's works and Amazon's The Rings of Power. And consider hitting the bell icon to set notifications to all, to stay up to date with my future uploads.